to that invasion curve, which we keep going back to because it's so important, and it really is a great way to illustrate the work that we do and how we decide to do our work. If we remember, the most effective and most efficient point on that invasion curve that we can address invasive species is at the beginning. It's the prevention category. So making sure that some of these plants and some of these insects and animals don't arrive here in the first place. Or if they are here, at least preventing spread from invaded to uninvaded areas. So what I wanted to do is kind of go through a couple of what are basically simple steps that you can take to help prevent or minimize the spread of some of these species. And this certainly isn't an exhaustive list, but it's just hitting some key things that are not overly burdensome, relatively easy actions that you can take on your properties or just changes in behavior that positively influence invasive species spread prevention. So one of the easy steps is to not use those invasive species in your gardening and landscaping and focus more on using natives and even non-invasives. So things that aren't going to escape cultivation, things that aren't going to take over natural areas, and species that in reality are going to provide the greatest benefit for wildlife, and a lot of them are still very pretty and attractive. If you do a lot of recreation, it's pretty easy to spread some of these plants, both on land and in water. So if you're hiking or bird watching or doing anything outdoors, an easy step is to clean your boots or clean your equipment or your clothing to make sure that you're not inadvertently spreading around small little seeds in the soles of your boots or attached to you or attached to your dog or something like that. So just brush yourself off, clean your boots before moving between areas. It's a really simple step and one that I try to do whenever I'm out and about. And the same goes for aquatic recreation. So if you're boating or fishing, when you leave a lake, make sure that you're checking your watercraft and you're checking your gear, making sure that there aren't fragments of plants attached to your trailer or vessel, making sure that there's not standing water in your bilge or your live well that could harbor small-bodied aquatic invasive organisms like the zebra mussel or spiny water flea, things that we can't see but can live in that water and be spread from one water body to another. So taking those simple steps or visiting a decontamination station if they're available in your region, or even just spraying your boat off at home. All of those things are really great steps that you can take to prevent the spread of some of these species. Don't move firewood. I'm sure this is a catchphrase that many of you have already heard. So when it comes to forest pests and pathogens, one of their primary spread mechanisms, once they arrive in New York State, one of the ways that they get around locally is firewood. So we have a regulation that prohibits the movement of firewood in New York more than 50 miles, but if you want to take it one step further, just buy local, find firewood where you go. Don't take the risk of moving your firewood because it could be harboring inside the larvae of invasive species or invasive insects. And last but not least, managing small infestations to limit their spread and minimize the impacts that they're already having on the environment. This is a great thing that you can do on your own properties or by getting engaged with a PRISM and participating in a management event. So by addressing invasive species, by managing them or treating them, you're slowing their spread across the landscape. It's recognizing that, yes, they're here, but we can slow their advances, and it's particularly important for some of those early detection species that John mentioned earlier. So things that aren't already widespread. If we start to address them where we find them, maybe we won't just slow them down, but we'll eradicate them. And a lot of these species are relatively easy to manage if they're caught early, but that is the key, is catching them early. You might want to choose to manage those dangerous plants so they're not impacting your health. And lastly, or not lastly, aesthetics, so just making it pretty. That's important to some folks. Or if you're thinking from more of an ecological standpoint, you might be trying to protect rare, unique species, either plants or animals, or increasing the value of your land for wildlife. So those are all factors that you can consider when trying to choose which species or which infestations to manage first. For us in the Adirondacks, managing Japanese knotweed, I'll talk about a couple of the tools or management techniques specific to this species. If they're small populations, you can do some mechanical control, so digging up the plants. I will say that it is a really tough plant. It has an incredible root system and its lateral distribution. So where you're actually seeing plants coming up out of the ground, those roots might be sticking 40 feet to each side underground. And in order to effectively manage this, you need to get rid of all of that above ground and below ground material. Anything that's left behind is going to send up new shoots. So digging up all those plants, bagging them, that can be one of the management tools that we implement for small populations. But most of the time, because we're working at a landscape scale and we're dealing with some larger patches, we'll use herbicides as our primary treatment mechanism. And we want to be selective as possible. I think that's important to mention, even though it's, I'm sure, on all of your minds. We don't just want to get rid of the invasive plants. We want to promote the recovery of native species at that site, or desirable species. So by using the stem injection technique, we deposit a small amount of herbicide into that hollow cane. We remember the inside of that is hollow. That herbicide goes directly into the target plant and is not going to affect any other vegetation around that. So that's one of the tools we use. For plants that are too small to inject, we'll do a foliar spray using a backpack or handheld sprayer, very selective to those invasives. And we're using, for both of these, a glyphosate-based herbicide product. Last but not least, your management process doesn't end at treating. Maybe we'll do some active restoration, like planting or depositing some seed. So in our region, we visit all of our sites annually after management. We visit them for several years, several consecutive years, to document whether there are invasive plants still present. We don't consider sites to be eliminated or eradicated until there have been at least 3 consecutive years of no invasive plants observed. We've been monitoring our sites for several years, for many years, and it was in 2013 that we really started to recognize that we weren't seeing these plants disappear at the rate that we were hoping for. So we kind of sat down, scratched our heads, and realized we needed to change our management action. And we started to use different types of herbicide products. And that change in management technique, I think, is what resulted in seeing more of these sites transitioning into being no plants observed. So it's important that you continue to reevaluate and adapt as you're trying to address some of these plants, whether it's Japanese knotweed or Himalayan balsam or myelin, any of them. It's important to continue to adapt. In summary, wrapping up, invasive species are threats to our ecology, to the economy and human health in New York State, and it's something that you should all become engaged and I hope interested in by engaging with your PRISM. So PRISMs are here regardless of where you live in New York State, whether it's the Catskills, the Adirondacks, Western New York. There is a PRISM available as a resource to you.